What's up everybody, how's it going? In this video, I want to share with you the 4 biggest regrets that I have as a software engineer. Now hopefully these regrets will either help you maybe avoid finding yourself in the same situation as I am, or perhaps you've already made the mistakes that I've made and you are going to relate to them. Either way, hopefully you take something out of this video, and with that said, let's jump into the first regret, which is that I wish I had started to code earlier in my life. A lot of you know I learned to code immediately after college, and I will say I'm the biggest proponent that anybody can learn to code at any time in their life, in their 20s, in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 100s, you get the idea. However, of course, just like with any other skill, the earlier you start to learn it and practice it, the better. And so I just think back, if I had started to code, let's say at the beginning of high school, I could have had 8 more years to practice the skill, to work on projects, on entrepreneurial endeavors. And yeah, I just regret not having done that. The good news is that, like a lot of other skills, I do think that you can catch up in coding pretty quickly to people who started before you, but nonetheless, it does remain a regret for me. So if you're young, considering learning how to code, do not hesitate. You won't regret it. Now, my second regret as a software engineer goes back to when I had just graduated from my coding bootcamp, when I was applying to jobs, preparing for coding interviews. I wish that I had used my company, AlgoExpert, to prepare for the coding interviews. It would have saved me so much trouble, so much pain, but alas, AlgoExpert didn't exist back then. The good news is that it does exist today, and so you can save yourself that trouble, that pain. Just go to algoexpert.io and use the promo code CLEM, C-L-E-M, for a discount on the platform. Okay, of course, I'm mildly joking, not really, but my real second regret is I wish I had exposed myself to more backend and infrastructure work. A lot of you know that when I was at Google, at Facebook, I was a front-end engineer, primarily working on the front end. On AlgoExpert, my company, I've basically only worked on the front end. Of course, I've done also like a bunch of content, but from an engineering point of view, I've only worked on the front end. And so my exposure to backend and infrastructure has only been from afar. I've worked alongside backend and infra engineers. I've seen some of their code reviews or some of their design docs. I've consumed their APIs, but I've never been the one making the backend decisions. I've never been the one writing the backend code. Sure, I've contributed to making backend decisions. I've given some of my input for, let's say, the structure of an API, but overall, I know that this is a gap in my software engineering knowledge. Whereas on the front end, I feel very good, not a true expert, but almost like an expert. On the back end or infrastructure, I do not feel at all like an expert. And I will say the caveat to this is that there is a benefit from not having exposed myself so closely to the back end and having focused purely on the front end, which is that, I've been able to progress in my career perhaps a little bit faster. I've been able to be more productive because there is an argument that being more specialized rather than being too, wide and spreading yourself too thin can be beneficial. But at the same time, I can't shake this feeling that I do regret not having had more exposure. I remember when I joined Facebook, I was strongly thinking of joining a backend team, but I ended up deciding against it because, in my mind, I was like, oh, this might hold me back from a career point of view because on the front end, I can just, get up and running the second I'm in the code base. It'll be, super comfortable for me. In hindsight, I kind of wish that I had pursued that discomfort, but perhaps I'll be able to do this, later on in my career. My third regret as a software engineer is actually kind of similar to the previous one. It's that I wish I had worked in more code bases. Ultimately, I have really only worked for long periods of time in 2 code bases. The code base that I worked on at Google, which was a front-end code base on the Google Cloud Platform product called Cloud IoT, Internet of Things. and then the AlgoExpert front-end code base. And believe it or not, both of those code bases are very similar to one another. They're similar because they're both front-end, they're both written in TypeScript. One of them is in React, AlgoExpert, whereas Google was in Angular, but both of them use Redux. Believe it or not, if you're familiar with front-end and Redux, we had Reduxified our Angular code base at Google. And both teams were pretty small. Like on AlgoExpert, I'm only me and Simon, our front-end engineer at Google, it was just a couple of other people. And so the styles of the code base, the code bases, the paradigms used in both code bases are very similar. And it's been great. I feel very comfortable in these code bases, or at least I felt comfortable in them back when I was at Google, but it's just very similar. It hasn't really shown me a lot of what's out there. And I did get a little bit of a peek at other code bases when I was at Facebook, for example, but I was only there for a couple of months. But I remember during boot camp at Facebook, where you try a bunch of different teams, I got to see a bunch of different code bases, some of them that had been written 5 years before, 10 years before, some of them were brand new, some of them used just completely different styles because different engineers had led them or had written in them, and it was pretty daunting, pretty scary to see these very unfamiliar code bases, but I do think that there's a lot of value in making yourself uncomfortable by seeing other code bases. I think the best analogy that I could make here is if you are someone who has only ever lived in one part of the world, let's say just like one city, New York City or San Francisco, then your view of the world is going to be very narrow. You're going to think that everything is done a certain way, and it's only once you start to travel that you start to see that, wait, there are a lot of different ways to do the same thing, different types of cultures and restaurants and, subway systems. I don't know, I'm giving you like a few examples. Hopefully you see how the analogy is comparable to the code base thing. But I just think that that's something that would have been very cool to have more experience with different code bases. And of course, hopefully for the rest of my career, I'll be able to experience more code bases. I've only been a software engineer for 4.5 years, so not that long. But yeah, it's definitely something that I think about. The fourth and final regret that I have as a software engineer is not taking more time to become better at Bash and Bash scripting. Now, as many of you know, Bash is basically a very integral part of a software engineer's life. Most software engineers work with Bash at least, a little bit in their everyday life. You open your terminal, you use a couple of commands to open directories, open files, navigate through directories. But a lot of software engineers aren't really good at Bash beyond these super basic commands. And I'm going to include myself in that group of software engineers. And it's kind of like in part due to laziness that I didn't learn more Bash and become better at it, and in part due to other priorities. Like these days, I just have other stuff that is seemingly more important to do. But it is kind of annoying because a lot of times I find myself wanting to do something in my terminal that is a little bit complicated, like editing a bunch of files based on certain patterns, or maybe looking for certain patterns again within a directory, or doing certain things that can be done with Bash scripting very elegantly, but that I just don't know how to do. And so I always find myself pinging my co-founder on AlgoExpert, Antoine, who is good at Bash, asking him to write a script for me. But yeah, that's a regret that I have. Like I said, I know that I could rectify this by just, putting in a little bit of time, not being lazy. I will definitely try to do that in the medium-term future. But my recommendation to you would be, if you do have a bit of time, probably take it to learn Bash scripting, become mildly good at it. It'll be something that you won't regret, I think. That wraps it up for my regrets as a software engineer. I don't have that many more regrets. Anything else that I can think of ultimately can kind of be bucketed under one of the 4 regrets that I mentioned in this video. Hopefully this will help you avoid some of them, or maybe you've already made some of the mistakes I've made and can relate to them. Let me know what you think about them. Are there any other regrets that I haven't mentioned that you have as a software engineer? I'm super curious to hear about them. If you enjoyed the video, definitely don't forget to smash the like button. It really helps me out. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. If you enjoy short form written content, follow me on LinkedIn and Twitter. Instagram if you like pictures, and otherwise I will see you in the next video.